Good evening, everyone. This is takeback.org. I'm Sheila, and we have so much to talk about. The world is like upside down politically, worldwide. I have to say, I think, are we in the age of Trump? Maybe it won't last as long as we hope it won't last, but so many of us were interested in seeing how to react to what's going on in the world today. And I have two very interesting guests who marched, who paid attention to what's happening, and have ideas about how we move forward in these interesting times. So first I see Judi Deglin. Hi, Judi.
Hello, Sheila.
Judi is a Norwich resident, and Judi marched in Philadelphia.
Yes, I did.
And next to Judi, we have Rabbi Rachel Safman. Hi, Rabbi.
How are you?
Good. It's good to have you here. Did you go on any of the marches that day?
I didn't participate in the marches because they fell on a Saturday, which for the Jewish community is our Sabbath, our day of rest. But I supported the activism of the marchers within the bounds defined by law from the pulpit.
That's wonderful. And Judi and I are very active members of Hadassah, which, as you know, is a Jewish volunteer organization. And the National Hadassah told us that we needed to listen to our own consciences as to whether or not to attend. Even though they couldn't sanction it or support it, they said they supported all of the goals, all of the values of the march, and so it let people like me and Judi feel very comfortable in attending, and I can understand your issues. And as I think we had a discussion at this at a coffee clutch that we do, and one of the most interesting speeches at the march was a rabbi from Los Angeles. So there were many people of faith there who were making their feelings known. So Judi, tell me, why did you march?
Well, I felt very strongly that it was an important time to show support for women's issues, to make sure that the incoming administration knew that we would be watching what they would be doing and observing any changes in the laws they were thinking about, and to just make some important points evident to them that we were going to be looking at women's reproductive rights and health rights, healthcare rights, and equal pay in the workplace rights, and other issues that are really very important to women, to make sure that stayed in their conscience, and that we would be observing how they would be handling those.
Now, I want to get back to everything that you said, but let me turn to Rabbi. So why would you have marched if it was not on a Sabbath?
You know, I think that the Jewish tradition, and that's the faith tradition that I represent, is unambiguous in assigning value to every human being and regarding the dignity of all human beings, and particularly the most vulnerable members of society, as the moral obligation of the public writ large. And I believe that the tone that was set by the Trump campaign back in the election cycle, and some of the actions of that administration, or of the Trump pre-inaugural forays, was so clearly in opposition to those values and so intent on the denigration of vulnerable groups that, to my mind, we could not in good faith sit quietly when that was going on. So whether we were marching with our feet or marching in our minds with those who are marching with their feet, I think we had an obligation to speak.
So did you march when George W. Bush got elected?
I had never marched before.
Okay.
I had never protested before. I came of age in the 60s, and my brother fought in the Vietnam War, so I actually did not participate in those anti-war marches because it was a very conflicted time for my family. My dad fought in World War II, became a citizen of the United States during the war, and so this was the first time I actually participated. And one of the reasons I did was because this march was not against something; it was for something. It was looking at being proactive rather than reactive. To coin a phrase from Rabbi Safman, I think it was really important. It just made a lot of sense to me, the whole women's rights are human rights.
Okay. But under George W. Bush, under other presidents before, women's rights were at issue. They had Supreme Court justices who struck down a lot of the things that we as women may have valued as important. So I think, my question is, what makes this particular thing so different that it organically sprung up a reaction of people who had never, ever thought that they would march before, or ever thought that the country needed them to march, because after all, this is America and everything sorts itself out here, and we have opposition, and then we have another election, and the things we value get concentrated on and get passed. But this, didn't it seem something extraordinary? Talk about that.
Typically in a democracy, as you said, Sheila, there are mechanisms whereby individuals with radically different views can engage with one another within the structure of the system, can debate their views based on the merit of their arguments, the merit of their positions, and come to some agreement that very well may not be consensus. It may leave some members of the discussion very displeased, but nevertheless, there are processes in place and the decisions made feel like they have the weight of the polity behind them. And in this instance, I think the nature of the discussion, or the absence of discussion, the way in which Trump and some of his followers are using quite underhanded tactics, including ad hominem attacks on individuals, including bypassing the media as a critical voice in the discussion, that is leaving a lot of people feeling that working within conventional structures is not enough, that there need to be other forces brought to bear to allow dissenting voices to be heard.
I also another reason that this was very important to me is the environment that was existing in the run-up to Trump being inaugurated. A lot of the language reminded me very much of the way that my father described Germany in the 30s.
So tell us about your heritage.
My parents were both born in Germany. They came here as teenagers separately. They met in this country. My mother was sent here when she was 16, leaving behind her mother and her younger sister. Her older sister was already here. My dad came with his younger brother. What families did is if they could get papers to get their teenagers out, they would just send them. My grandmother and my aunt were deported in 1942 and died in Theresienstadt, a concentration camp. And the way that my father spoke frequently about what it was like, first of all, how important it is to vote. He considered voting a duty, not an option. And the way that he described Germany in the 30s was just so reminiscent of what I was seeing in the run-up. Like the whole one scapegoating other populations and the sort of autocratic attitude. And personally, I was frightened by the people that he surrounded himself with.
Okay. What about you, Rabbi? Tell us about your heritage.
So my family also came to this country in order to escape the growing anti-Semitism in Europe. My grandparents were lucky in that they were living, they were born in what was then the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and after losing the First World War, the Hungary where they were living already started to become a more anti-Semitic climate, a less hospitable place for Jews to live, and so they decided to leave before all of the legislative obstacles were in place to stop them from doing so, but they weren't able to bring any of their family out. My grandparents were in each instance the only members of their family who got out of Europe before it was impossible to leave. My father's family, that was my mother's family, my father's family also were fortunate in retrospect to have fled poverty in the Russian Pale and to have come to this country before the gates to entry were thrown shut, but they saw the family that they had left behind close behind those walls and disappear.
And let me ask, we have another guest, Leslie Ginsburg. Hi, Leslie.
Hi.
And you were part of our discussion group. Can you tell us about your heritage?
Well, I know my mother came from Warsaw, Poland. My grandfather, my father's father, came from Austria. My husband's family came from Vilna, in Russia. So they've all been here a long time. They left Europe because of the same reasons that everybody else did. They left because of the anti-Semitism there, and what we're feeling here now is the same thing. We're all feeling the same thing that our families felt before. With the people that Trump has surrounded himself with the way Trump talks about women. Women are entitled to their own bodies, their own lives, to take care of themselves, to make their own decisions. And what I'm seeing from the same thing what happened in Europe, where people were not allowed to make their own lives and make their own decisions. And now we're having the same thing here in the States, and it's very frightening for all of us. Anybody that you talk to says the same thing about their family's heritage in Europe, in Germany, and we're seeing signs, everybody's seeing signs of what's happening there, what is happening here today.
And just to finish that circle, my mother escaped from Ukraine in 1921. Right before the gates were closed in Ellis Island. She arrived in 1923 after living for 2 years in Romania, waiting for passage from Bucharest, getting sponsored by some family here in the States. And they left, they fled. They fled the pogroms, the anti-Semitism during the Russian Civil War after the Russian Revolution. So we all have similar backgrounds. But the interestingness...
One of the other things that sort of polarized me was my aunt and my grandmother had arranged passage to the United States, but the quotas had been fulfilled. So they had to arrange passage to Cuba and were not able to get out. And to me, with the refugee, the travel ban now, I just think of families that are trying to get here who are going through the same thing. Mm-hmm. And it's incomprehensible to me.
Okay. But the question that this all brings up is, when you say that this harkens back to the fears and the feelings that our forebears had in Germany and Austria and Russia during the late 1800s, the early 20th century, I have to pause and I have to say, think of my mother. She believed that America was the savior. America, Ellis Island, New York City, was the place where everyone is safe in the world. And that anything that happened back in Russia or even after World War II couldn't possibly happen here, because after all, he has his language, he has the insults, the threatening language, the fear, the lack of truth and ethics. The press is being challenged. But we still do have our political mechanisms. We have another branch of government. We have a House and a Senate. We have the court system. We have the criminal justice system. Should we really be that afraid that all of those other mechanisms will fail us and bring us to the brink of what happened in Germany? What do you say to that?
I believe that the way that democracies function and the way that they maintain themselves as vibrant entities is through an engaged citizenry. And so one of the reasons that I think we could claim that it couldn't happen here, that hopefully we will be able 50 years from now or 100 years from now, looking back at this era, to say it didn't happen here, is not because teleologically that could never transpire, but rather because as individuals see the warning signs that an autocratic regime is taking hold, they stand up to it and are given the platforms by which to take a stand against it. So I think it's exactly the sort of response that is that dike that keeps the floodwaters of an authoritarian regime from overwhelming our society. Sitting back and saying the miracle of democracy will protect us is, I think, a naive position that doesn't adjust.
And you think that the march energized not just Americans, because there were marches all over the world. They had marches in Antarctica and in Iceland and you name it. There were marches in small middle America, small Republican cities of 300 people, and 1,000 people came to march. So something is rising up, and do you think that that is a good bulwark against the fear and against the possibility of autocracy? Is that good enough?
I don't think we need to caution against the fear. I think the fear is a protective, a therapeutic or appropriate response at this moment for exactly the reasons that were given, that I think that some of the warning signs that we're seeing are very worrisome, and we shouldn't sit passively in face of these sorts of developments. But I think that this uprising of an organic response from the populations here in Europe, as you said, in Asia, in Australia, around the world, that those are going to be the mechanisms that fence in this assault on our democratic values and that allow us to ride out this very difficult period, not only, I dare say, in American history, but in world history, because there are nationalist forces preaching xenophobia, preaching the erection of borders and a fixed pie view of the world that turns one group against another, that are being heard throughout Europe. We're seeing them in the Middle East. We're seeing them in this country. It's not a unique phenomenon, unfortunately, to our borders.
Let's talk about the march, because Judi, you said you thought it was more of a positive in favor of women's issues, but you know it went far beyond that. We were civil rights issues, immigration issues, international issues, as well as issues involving just women. But there also was an anti-Trump flavor to these marches. Clearly, some of the most fun, interesting signs were anti-Trump signs that brought up these issues in a kind of a pointed way.
I thought it was my impression that the organizers of these marches put the word out fairly early that they wanted it to be not entirely anti-Trump or be negative. They wanted to make sure that this was looking at globally at women's issues, at marginalized women, at women of color, at women from minorities, that whole, much more global thing. And I think one of the things that came out of the marches is now there's a template for reaching a very, very large group of people. And that template looked like that template now exists with social media as a facilitator. It's very easy to get that to happen.
Now, I see you brought a couple of the
hats.
Pink hats. Tell us, what was the idea behind them and making them?
Well, it was sort of a way that people could identify as a group when they were participating in the march.
Why don't you just hold them up so we can see them?
And put one on. Put one on. Yeah, let's put one on.
This is a little more fashionable, I think. It has little ears.
Mm-hmm.
And it came out of there were two young women in San Francisco who thought it would be nice if there could be something you made yourself that would sort of energize people and sort of get them to think of themselves as a group. And it really caught on. So, a lot of people, I knitted 10 hats. I took extra hats. I met people who said, "Oh, can I have one? Can I, they're cool." And I said, "Oh, have a couple of extra." Trade names. It was kind of a cool thing, and there were many permutations of the hat. People were very creative.
Sure,
I thought that was very cool, and one person came up to me and said, "Oh, is that supposed to look like a uterus?" I thought that was kind of funny. They didn't understand the connotation of the feline connotation of that. So, some of the upcoming marches have been equally creative with a hatwear that's to be knitted.
Right,
so it's and people were knitting hats. People who couldn't march were knitting hats in the retirement homes and nursing homes. And they were sent to a central point in D.C. They were collecting them so that anybody who wanted one could have one.
So tell us, I went to D.C. and it was huge, and the speeches went on for 3, 4, 5 hours practically. They couldn't hold the march as they envisioned it because the march route was just packed. They had to alternate it to a couple of other streets. And tell me about the Philadelphia march and the feeling you had.
The Philadelphia march was the initial attendance was supposed to be 20,000, and it was held in the Parkway in front of the Art Museum. If you've seen the Rocky movies, that's the steps he ran up in the movie. They had 50,000 plus. And you could tell that we were at the beginning of the march, and if you turned around and looked down the Parkway, it just went on forever. Everybody was very respectful and responsible and friendly, and I was very impressed by the number of women who were, I would say, significantly older than me who were marching. And a lot of children brought along, many men. It was great. And simultaneously to that march, there was a large LGBTQ convention going on in Philadelphia, and they broke up at noon, and 2,000 of those folks joined us. So it was a great experience.
Okay, so we had a great experience. We brought millions of people worldwide together to announce our values. So where do we go from here? How do we translate all of that energy, all of those values? How do we translate them into action going forward? What do we do?
I think clearly one of the things that not only Trump, but the Republican Party has done phenomenally well, and we see that not in the election of Trump per se, but in the fact that he stands now atop a government in which the Republicans hold a majority in both houses of Congress, is that they have systematically built support or defined the boundaries of constituencies to see that they would have their representatives elected to national office, elected for that matter to state and even now local office, and that they would be able, by enforcing party unity, to drive through whatever agenda the party set. And frankly, the Democratic Party has not worked as systematically to see to it that it was able to maintain a base in the various legislatures from the local level up to the national level.
You know, more people voted Democrat for House of Representative seats than voted Republican, but because of the districting and how the Republican state legislatures, and they're the majority in the state legislatures, were able to gerrymander the districts, the Republicans had more Congress people. And that's the same thing happened with the Electoral College. So more people voted Democrat. But we have to, so how do we have to?
So we need to be working systematically in terms of the redefinition of district boundaries, and also in terms of getting the message out, not to the choir, not to the individuals who already find fault with the Trump administration and the proposals it's putting forward, but those who were willing to give him a chance because he represented to them the opportunity for positive, constructive change from a status quo that was untenable. We need to be bringing the message to them that the type of change that he's offering is not a change that's working in their interests, and we need to take those presently secure Republican seats and cast them into question, particularly if the occupants of those seats are willing to continue to abide by a party mandate that has them operating in lockstep with their commander-in-chief.
Okay. That's all great, but it does come down to getting the vote out in 2018. And one of the things that the Democratic Party has not done well is we show up for the presidential elections, but we don't show up for the midterms. And many studies have shown that the people who don't show up would tend to be voting Democratic or voting against the Republicans. So we have to work very hard for 2018 and get the vote out, and we have to work very hard to get control of more legislatures and get more control of the districting process, because in 2020 we have the next reapportionment, we have the next census, which leads to the drawing of the districts for the next 10 years. That's so critical, and the Republicans were able to do that very successfully in 2010. So your points are great. How do we get people out to vote, Leslie?
Well, I have something before we talk about that. It's very upsetting because he's going to be bringing judges in. And to me, that's really frightening. I mean, because as you see, the new judge that was just interviewed and going around speaking to Democrats and Republicans and want to be voted in. Now what happens when he comes in and he's got the same mindset as Trump? And then we have Pence, who makes the decision. He's the deciding vote in the Republican Party. So it's all well and good to say that the Democrats and the Republican and the way our system works, but the way the system seems to be working now is when you bring the new judges in, if the judges are going to be Trump mindset, we are all going to be...
Well, that's a good point, because we have presidents for 4 years or 8 years. We have judges for life.
Right.
And one of the good things that happened under Obama is he was able to put on the bench through his appointments about 300 federal judges. And some of these lower district courts that are making these rulings against that immigration plan, against that travel ban, or whatever you want to call it, have been appointees by Democratic presidents.
Right.
But you're right. The fact that we have a Republican president now means that his appointments can have lasting effects for generations.
Of course.
And you put on this Gorsuch, he's only 49 years old.
Right.
He could be there for the next 40 or 50 years.
Right.
So these are critical issues. But, you know, during the election, I kept talking my head off. Supreme Court, Supreme Court, Supreme Court. It doesn't register. We don't have an educated electorate, do we? This is another very important
Yes.
point.
We have a very apathetic electorate. I think that both those who came out to vote but voted for a Trump because it was just not what they were used to, and all the more so those who stayed home because they weren't so enthused by Hillary Clinton and what she promised, all walked into this election cycle with a mindset that America was such a big and cumbersome ship of state that it really couldn't be thrown that far out of kilter, that whatever they did, they were going to wake up tomorrow in essentially the same country that they had left when they went to bed the night before.
Right, we'll go on living till the next election, and our lives will go on.
Well, you asked about the vote. So now that I think about it, did you watch the Grammys last night? Well, it starts from there. If the vote starts from there and everybody's feeling that his wall that's going to be built and the banning of different nationalities, and now you're watching last night the Grammys. And you could see where they took the votes of the people that won and the people that were entertaining us. It starts from there. It starts from the bottom up. It was a black person, it was a white person, it was a Chinese person, it was somebody from England.
Yeah, but he's doing
So
it.
it's starting, the votes to get there is to watch our entertainers who are feeling the same way we do.
It's a lot. He is using the fact that Hollywood, New York, the elites, he's using those to actually bring his base up to him and using them to denigrate them. Oh, those are just those entertainers. They don't know anything. They're not part of the real politics here.
I think also we need to remember that the way he delivered himself to the electorate was using simple language. I think he rarely used words that were more than 7 letters.
He speaks on it. They announced it, analyzed it on a 6th grade level.
Right,
Or
but that's
fifth
what
grade-
they
fifth
tell you.
grade
For
level.
example, that's the same lesson that you get when you're in healthcare. If you want people to comply with instructions,
Have to wrap up.
you stick with words that are 7 letters or
Okay.
less. And I think because he spoke on their level, more people, they didn't feel threatened by
Well-
him maybe. And I think the Democrats need to remember that when they get the grassroots efforts
I think
rolling.
that was true also, but part
Yes.
of it was just the sheer power of celebrity in this country, our adulation for celebrities and getting to know them. They were in your living room and the TV. And it's sad, but I think that's a big part of it. We have to wrap up. We're going to do this again. But what are we going to do tomorrow? What are you going to do tomorrow to make a change in it?
I think it's important. Trump has tried to force us, this has been his pattern, as I understand it, in his business negotiations in all different walks of life. He wants to get his opposition on their back foot, always responding to the tone that he sets to the issues he puts on the table. And I think in order for us to be centered and to press our own agenda, we need to define in our own terms what that agenda is. So choose one issue that you believe is going to be embattled over the next 4 years and pursue it in all of its various incarnations. And if people do that across the spectrum, across a variety of issues, perhaps standing with others where they need the support, but seeing to it that they're holding their own and systematically prosecuting their own agenda, that we stand a chance of change.
Those are great final words. Let's hope that what you say, Rabbi, will come to fruition and everybody will do their part. So this has been a great takeback.org. We'll be back to talk about this again and again. We'll see you next week, takeback.org. Good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you.